Hello! In this video, I will be giving a brief summary of the US foreign policy during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States was mainly concerned with addressing the geopolitical and military threat to its security from the Soviet Union, and of course with the fear of the spread of communism. Meaning, there was the communist ideological character of the Soviet Union that was as much of a concern to US policymakers as the geopolitical threat. The Cold War lasted for almost 50 years, and it became a political, ideological, and military struggle for global power between the US and the Soviet Union. From the end of World War II until the early 1990s, the Cold War became the United States' preeminent international concern, influencing all of the nation's major foreign policy decisions. As soon as the Soviet Union emerged from the Russian Empire, tensions between the Soviets and the United States began. The fear of the spread of communist ideology, which is an anti-capitalist governmental system, directly affected U.S. foreign policy making. The liberal democratic characteristics of the American polity created an identity based on freedoms, and therefore they felt that they had an obligation to protect democratic nations from a communist dictatorship. After World War II, tensions increased exponentially as the U.S. demonstrated its nuclear power and the Soviet Union took control of Eastern European nations into its bloc. The World War II former allies quickly became enemies again. For US leaders, Soviet actions communicated that they could no longer be seen as a partner or ally, but rather a competitor and fully committed to establishing a very different, if not the opposite, set of systems in Eastern Europe and in the world. By 1947, the U.S. had developed a clear policy of containment toward the Soviet Union, attempting to prevent the spread of communism through economic, diplomatic, and military measures. The Marshall Plan was a U.S. program created to provide aid to Western Europe following the devastation of World War II. And in addition to economic redevelopment, one of the stated goals of the Marshall Plan was to stop the spread of communism on the European continent. Through the Marshall Plan, the U.S. spent almost $13 billion in aid to fight communism by helping the post-war devastated Europe recover its infrastructure and economy. In addition, the United States also spent almost $3 million on supplies during the struggle over in West Berlin. However, later on, the Soviet Union lifted its blockade and built the Berlin Wall, in which divided into a capitalist and communist Berlin. Therefore, the US and Western European nations created NATO, a diplomatic and military alliance for mutual protection against the communist threat and military cooperation to contain communism. As the idea of what it meant to be an American and what American values were was influencing on how the policymakers viewed themselves. U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War involved in protecting free people resisting authoritarianism. Then they also created the Truman Doctrine that promised monetary and military aid to support any group of people affected by communist regimes. The doctrine helped relieve the development concern in the situation in Greece, where communists were fighting a civil war against pro-Western governments supported by the British. The end of the British support due to economic issues led to the communist victory. Therefore, the U.S. saw this as a threat to the security of not only Turkey, but also in the Middle East. With the US concerns with the spread of communism, the country started to dramatically increase nuclear power productions. As a result, the Soviet Union took the same measures for its own security. The security dilemma says that under anarchy, when a state increases its own security reacting from other states' actions or military investments, it leads to an arms race like the Cold War. Since both powers knew the effects of a nuclear war, they never really intended to use the weapons as it would create a total destruction for both. Therefore, the weapons were used as a deterrence measure to a future military conflict. Also, the communist North Korean invasion of South Korea was seen by the United States as an act of aggression across the recognized international boundary. This was the main event changing containment policy first adopted by the US to a policy of diplomatic threats to the construction of a major military alliance with NATO countries. The United States sent combat forces to South Korea soon after the invasion. The North Korean communist invasion seemed to be a signal to the extreme and aggressive communist policies. The US interpreted the invasion as a coordinated plan of communist expansion directed by the Soviet Union, rather than as a local civil war supported by the Soviets. As a result, the US also played a role on military interventions in many third world countries by funding, training, arming, and directing of local anti-communist forces waging forms of armed struggle against revolutionary states. With the rise of the domino effect idea, in which countries neighboring a newly created revolutionary or communist state would fall to communism like dominoes, led to the Vietnam intervention. The Vietnam War was between the north side of Vietnam against the south and the United States. With the fear of South Vietnam falling to communism, President Kennedy increased U.S. aid in military forces. The war was costly for the United States, as thousands of people died and Vietnam became a unified socialist country after the U.S. withdrew its troops. During Kennedy's administration, the U.S. supported a failed attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro, eschewing a naval blockade with the threat of nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis started after Soviet Union strategic rocket forces installed nuclear missiles in Cuba to increase the capabilities of its nuclear forces in response to the missiles installed by the United States and Turkey. In response to the missiles in Cuba, Kennedy demanded the Soviet weapons to be removed and ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba as a blockade to stop any more missiles coming to the island. It was 13 days of negotiation where both countries had to follow strategies to achieve the best possible outcome. They knew that an offensive attack would lead to a nuclear war. Therefore, it would have been the worst outcome. The United States negotiated with the Soviet Union via black channels. In the 1970s, President Nixon attempted cooperation and alleviated tensions with the Soviet Union. Nixon visited Communist China and engaged in several diplomatic meetings with the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, in which the two leaders discussed nuclear arms production. By the end of the decade, tensions once again increased when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. When President Reagan took office, he denounced the Soviet Union as the evil empire and dramatically increased military budgets in an attempt to win the Cold War. Despite President Reagan's offensive policies, tensions between the two superpowers started to warm up in the late 1980s. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev adopted friendly relations with the West and instituted liberal domestic reforms through glasnost, which is a policy created as part of the political reform for new, open policy in the Soviet Union, where people could freely express their opinions. And they also created perestroika, which is a policy created to reform the Soviet economy in an attempt to improve the situation in the country by decentralizing the control of the government on economic aspects of the Soviet Union. In the end, the struggling Soviet economy led to the end of the Cold War as the Soviet Union collapsed.